Arizona.
I want to thank Senator Levin for his eloquent statement and comments concerning this amendment, and I thank him for his leadership on it. You know, I've been many years in the Senate consideration of the Defense Authorization Bill. This is probably one of the most interesting, I think my colleague will agree, because we're beginning with a measure that, if not passed, will result in a veto by the President of the United States of America. And I want to say that I appreciate this letter that the President of the United States sent to Senator Levin and to me and to the entire Senate. I want to say that I appreciate the President's courage, because right now the votes are not there. Right now, I think my friend from Michigan would agree the votes are not there to pass this amendment. So what the President has said, not only do we need to stop the production of the F-22, of which we've already constructed 187, but we need to do business differently. We need to have a change in the way we do business in order to save the taxpayers unneeded billions of dollars. And so this will be kind of an interesting moment in the history of a new presidency and a new administration, and frankly, an old Secretary of Defense. And I say old in the respect that he obviously covers both administrations, and I don't know of a Secretary of Defense who has had more appreciation and admiration from both sides of the aisle than Secretary Gates. And I appreciate very much Secretary Gates' letter also, where he describes in some detail, as does the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, why we need to have this amendment passed to remove the additional F-22s. And I want to emphasize additional. But I want to pay special appreciation to President Obama for taking a very courageous step here in making it very clear, as he says, as Secretary Gates and the military leadership have determined, we do not need these planes. That is why I will veto any bill that supports acquisition of F-22s beyond the 187 already funded by Congress. The statement is very clear, and I appreciate it, and I hope that it has a significant impact on my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So again, my appreciation to President Obama, and my appreciation to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as the Secretary of Defense, who lay out in more detail why it is that we need to eliminate this unneeded $1.75 billion for 7 additional F-22s. Now, again, I want to emphasize to my colleagues that these funds will go to the acquisition of the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, which, when produced, will provide a careful balance between the air superiority provided by the F-22 and the other capabilities of the Joint Strike Fighter, which is also badly needed. So this argument is not about the capability of the F-22, although that will be brought to the floor, and I intend to talk a little bit about many of the difficulties that the F-22 has had. But I'd also like to point out that the F-22 has never flown in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a remarkable statement. It's been in production since December 2005. We're in July of 2009. The F-22 has yet to fly in combat in the 2 wars that we're engaged in. And it's been plagued with some significant maintenance problems, not to mention dramatic cost overruns. So this is not an argument about whether the F-22 is an important capability for our nation's defense. It is. The question is when do we stop buying them? So it's important to note, I quote from the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff letter, it's important to note that the F-35 is a half-generation newer aircraft than the F-22, more capable in a number of areas such as electronic warfare and combating enemy air defenses. To sustain U.S. overall air dominance, the Department's plan is to buy roughly 500 F-35s over the next 5 years and more than 2,400 over the life of the program. So an argument that may be made on the floor here that somehow we are curtailing or inhibiting the ability of the United States Air Force to carry out its responsibilities to defend this nation, I think are contradicted at least by the views of the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and literally every other individual or position that is involved in this debate. The Secretary of Defense goes on to say, under this plan, the United States by 2020 is projected to have some 2,500 manned fighter aircraft. Almost 1,100 of them will be fifth-generation F-35s and F-22s. Now there's going to be a lot of debate and discussion about China and its emerging capabilities. Secretary of Defense goes on to say, China, by contrast, is expected to have only slightly more than half as many manned fighter aircraft by 2020, none of them fifth generation. I am concerned about the rising military capabilities of China. They are increasing their naval and maritime capabilities. They are increasing the efficiencies of their army and their entire overall inventories, and it is of great concern. But with the combination of the F-35 and the F-22, we will clearly have a significant advantage over the Chinese for some period of time. Now, that is not to any way denigrate the long-term aspect of the Chinese military buildup. But in the short term, this is the best way to make sure that we maintain complete superiority with a mixture of the F-35 and the F-22. Secretary goes on to say, the F-22 program proposed in the President's budget reflects the judgment of two different presidents, two different Secretaries of Defense, three Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the current Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Now, my colleagues are going to come to the floor and say, the Chief of the Air National Guard says we need additional F-22s. We don't disregard that opinion, but we do weigh that opinion as opposed to the opinion and judgment of the individuals that I just cited. If the Air Force is forced to, it goes on to say in his letter, if the Air Force is forced to buy additional F-22s beyond what has been requested, it will come at the expense of other Air Force and Department of Defense priorities and require deferring capabilities in areas we believe are much more critical for our nation's defense. There is no free lunch. There is no free $1.75 billion. There is no free money. Here we are with a projected $1.8 trillion deficit, a decrease overall in some defense areas that is coming sooner or later, and we cannot afford a $1.75 billion procurement that is not absolutely needed. And I want to state very clearly, F-22 is a good airplane. The fact that it hasn't flown in Iraq or Afghanistan is telling, and some of the issues that I'll mention later on is telling, but this is not an attack on the F-22. What it is an assessment of the nation's national security needs and what we need in its inventory to maintain our superiority over all other nations and meet the various threats ranging from radical Islamic extremism to the conventional capabilities of a rising power in the East. So, again, I want to say thanks to the great leadership of our Secretary of Defense and Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the importance they place on this amendment. So I'd like to refer my colleagues to an article that appeared on last Friday in the Washington Post. Is entitled "Premier U.S. Fighter Jet Has Major Shortcomings." And Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that this article be included in the record.
Without objection.
So, and I quote in part from this article, which I think is worthy of my colleagues' examination. It's by Mr. R. Jeffrey Smith, a person who is widely respected on defense issues. And he says, the United States top fighter jet, the Lockheed Martin F-22, has recently required more than 30 hours of maintenance for every hour in the skies, pushing its hourly cost of flying per hour to more than $44,000, a far higher figure than for the warplane it replaces, confidential Pentagon test results show. And it goes on to talk about some of the problems that it has experienced. And it goes on to say, while most aircraft fleets become easier and less costly to repair as they mature, key maintenance trends for the F-22 has been negative in recent years. And on average, from October last year to this May, just 55% of the deployed F-22 fleet has been available to fulfill missions guarding U.S. airspace, the Defense Department acknowledged this week. The F-22 has never been flown over Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, I would point out that the cost per aircraft is around $350 million, depending on how you calculate it. Now, we've got a $350 million airplane investment by the taxpayers of America that's never been flown over Iraq or Afghanistan, the two conflicts in which we are engaged in. Now, we know for a fact that much older aircraft, the A-10, the F-18, many of the older aircraft are flying routine missions, and plus our newest kinds of technology in drone and Predator aircraft. So, sensitive information about troubles, the article goes on to say, sensitive information about troubles with the nation's foremost air defense fighter is emerging in the midst of a fight between the Obama administration and the Democrat-controlled Congress. I put on my colleagues, the Democrat-controlled Congress, over whether the program should be halted by next year at 187 planes, far short of what the Air Force and the F-22's contractors around the country had anticipated. And there are divisions over in the Pentagon. It says, votes by the House and Senate Armed Services Committee last month to spend $369 million to $1.75 billion more to keep the F-22 production line open were propelled by mixed messages from the Air Force, including a quiet campaign for the plane that includes snazzy new Lockheed videos for key lawmakers. I don't think that the chairman or I received this snazzy new Lockheed video. But anyway, and intense political support from states where the F-22's components are made. The full House ratified the vote on June 25th, and the Senate is scheduled to begin consideration. After deciding to cancel the program, Defense Secretary Robert Gates called the $65 billion fleet a, quote, niche silver bullet solution to a major aerial war threat that remains distant. He described the House's decision as, quote, a big problem, and has promised to urge President Obama to veto the bill. The administration's position is supported by military reform groups, and we go on, and in the article it talks about pilots who have flown the aircraft who really talk about its impressive capability. I do not disagree with those assessments at all. Its troubles have been detailed in dozens of Government Accountability Office reports and Pentagon audits. But Pierre Sprey, a key designer in the 1970s and 1980s of the F-16 and A-10 warplanes, said that from the beginning, the Air Force designed it to be, quote, too big to fail, that is, to be cancellation-proof. Lockheed farmed out more than 1,000 subcontracts to vendors in more than 40 states. I'd like to repeat that. Lockheed farmed out more than 1,000 subcontracts to vendors in more than 40 states. And Spray, now a prominent critic of the plane, said that by the time skeptics could point out the failed tests, the combat flaws, and the exploding costs, most congressmen were already defending their subcontractors' revenues. John Hamre is an individual known to all of us and a very capable individual who once was on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff and served in previous administrations. He was a Pentagon's comptroller from 93 to 97, says the department approved the plane with a budget it knew was too low because projecting the real costs would have been politically unpalatable on Capitol Hill. Quote, "We knew that the F-22 was going to cost more than the Air Force thought it was going to cost, and we budgeted the lower number, and I was there," Hamre told the Senate Armed Services Committee in April. Quote, "I'm not proud of it," Hamre added in a recent interview. And by the way, I think it's a mark of the quality of the individual that he admits that he made a mistake, as we all do from some time to another. So, Mr. President, I don't want to spend too much time on this article because it's a long one, but it's an important item for our colleagues to consider when we consider the vote on this amendment. Cancellation decision got public support from the Air Force's top 2 civilian and military leaders, who said the F-22 was not a top priority in a constrained budget. But the leader's message was muddied in a June 9th letter from Air Combat Commander John D.W. Corley to Chambliss, that's Senator Chambliss, the senator from Georgia, that said halting production would put execution of our national military strategy at high risk in the midterm. The right size of the fleet, he said, is 381. It's enough to say that given our overall joint capability to obtain air superiority, stopping the F-22 at 187 fighters is vital to achieving the correct balance. Now, I discussed already the importance of a 5th-generation aircraft. And I discussed earlier the importance of us making these tough decisions. Not irrelevant to this debate is the view of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Cartwright. Now, General Cartwright is a Marine general aviator, and he's Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he serves as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs' most senior advisor on joint operational requirements. In recent testimony before the Armed Services Committee, General Cartwright outlined why, in his best military judgment, the F-22 program should be terminated. He said, quote, "Looking at the lines in hot production, the number one priority was to get 5th-generation fighters to all of the services. Number 2 priority was to ensure that we had a hot production line in case there was a problem. And number 3 was to have that hot production line producing F-18Gs, which support the electronic warfare fight." In General Cartwright's view, those issues stacked up to a solid position, that it was time to terminate the F-22. It's a good airplane. It's a 5th-generation fighter. But we needed to proliferate those 5th-generation fighters to all of the services, and we needed to ensure that we were capable of continuing to produce aircraft for the electronic warfare capability. In the F-18, we can also produce frontline fighters that are more capable of addressing any threat we'll face for the next 5 to 10 years. Interesting comment. He's saying in the F-18, we can also produce frontline fighters that are more capable of addressing any threat that we'll face for the next 5 to 10 years. So, in any case, let me all clear up the record on the same discussion about the risk that the Air Force is taking on by ending the F-22 line at 187 aircraft. Reference to some of that discussion appear to have been taken out of context. The Air Force's acceptance of risk by discontinuing the program needs to be understood in the context of the Air Force's overall Combat Air Force Restructure Plan, a plan that's intended to bridge the Air Force's current fleet to the predominantly fifth-generation force of the future. Basically, that plan works by restructuring the Air Force's current fleet of fighters now and directing resulting savings to fund modifying newer or more reliable fighters in the legacy fleet, weapons procurement, and joint enablers. Under the plan, those investments will help create a more capable fleet that can bridge the Air Force to a future fleet with a smaller, more capable force. As you can imagine, the effectiveness of the plan depends on a lot of moving parts, perhaps most importantly, stopping the F-22 program at 187 fighters now. While some short-term risk in the Air Force's fighter force may arise from stopping the program at 187 aircraft, the Combat Air Force Restructure Plan is designed to accept that risk to ensure a more capable fleet in the long term. I believe that this strategy is sound and needs the support of this body. Please do not be deluded by references to risk associated with ending the F-22 program. Given the strength of the reasons cited by the National Command Authority, the best professional military advice of the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, considered recommendations of the service secretaries, I can find no good reason why I should replace their judgment on this critical national defense issue with my own and call for funding for the continuation of the F-22 program. I respectfully suggest that the members of this body do the same and support the amendment under consideration. Now, Mr. President, I understand where votes are. I understand that right now, probably this morning anyway, it may be, I hope, that the very forceful letter by the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the very strong letter from the President of the United States will move my colleagues in support of this amendment. But I have no illusions about the influence of the military-industrial complex in this town. Long ago, President Eisenhower, when he left office, probably the most respected military leader, or certainly one of the most respected military leaders ever to occupy the White House, warned America about the military-industrial complex and the power and the increasing influence that he saw that military-industrial complex having over the decision-making made here in the Congress and into the administration and in the funding of different programs and the expenditure of the taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. Now, we are really at a very interesting moment, if not a seminal one, in the history of this administration. If we accept the President of the United States' threat to veto and overcome individual concerns, I think it'll be a great step forward to providing the taxpayer with a far better usage of their hard-earned dollars. These are difficult and terrible economic times for America. We cannot afford business as usual. We cannot afford to continue to purchase weapon systems that are not absolutely vital to this nation's security. I would point out again, and maybe it's not appropriate to keep mentioning, this plane has never been flown over Iraq or Afghanistan. It's never part of the two wars that we've been in. It's a good airplane, and it'll probably be important in the 187 of them that we are procuring to the security of this nation. But to continue production and procurement at some $350 million a copy, when in the judgment of the people we give the responsibility to make the judgment, in the strongest possible terms have told us, we need to move on to another aircraft. We need the Joint Strike Fighter, and we do not need any more of the F-22 aircraft. So it's a very interesting time. I look forward to the debate and vote on this amendment as soon as possible. I respect the views of my colleagues who feel very strongly that we need to continue the production of this aircraft. but I think it's wrong. And I hope that we can have an enlightened and respectful debate on this issue. I understand the passion that some of my colleagues have about it and the importance it is to jobs in their states and communities. I would point out again, defending this nation and expenditure of the taxpayers' dollars for its defense should not be based on jobs. It should be based on our national security needs. They are not unlimited amounts of money. So I want to thank my colleague, the distinguished chairman, again, and I'm sure that both of those letters have been included in the record. So, Madam President, I yield the floor.